I am sitting in the cinema and the movie is a complete waste of time. I'm thinking about leaving, but I've already spent the time watching the first half and the tickets were quite expensive. Are those sensible considerations or am I the victim of a fallacy here? We'll find out today. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today we continue the topic of biases and fallacies. Today we'll have a look at the sunk cost fallacy. This one applies wherever you hear things like, oh, I've already spent so much money, time, energy, whatever on this thing, I can't stop now. For example, let's say I'm watching a series and it's really bad and it gets worse by episode. However, I've already watched the first half of the season, so it would be a waste to stop now, wouldn't it? Or let's say at my company we have this project that's really not going well. The costs are increasing day by day and there's hardly any chance left it will ever be successfully completed. But after investing so much money and effort into it, we can't just abort it, can we? Or let's say I'm in a marriage and we are both unhappy. However, we invested so much hard blood into this marriage. We can't just get a divorce, can we? Or let's say I dislike my profession. I'm totally unhappy at work. I'd rather do something entirely different. But I've spent years of my life for the education for this profession. I can't just switch to something else, can I? What is the problem with this line of thinking? Let me make you an offer. You invest 45 minutes of your life and you get, well, let's say you're sitting comfortably. This isn't a very good offer, is it? You probably have something better to do with your time. Now imagine the situation from the beginning. You're sitting in a cinema and you're watching a dull movie. Yeah, well, now the situation is different, isn't it? Because you already invested time watching the first half and you invested money paying for the ticket. Does this really make a difference? The time you spent watching the first half and the money you paid for the ticket, those are sunk costs, which means they are in the past and they are irreversible. There is no way you can get this time and money back, no matter what you do from now on. It doesn't make any difference what you decide to do. The money and time is lost either way. So it should not have any bearing on your decision. You should completely ignore the sunk costs if you want to make a sensible decision. However, we hardly do that. And this is the sunk cost fallacy. The consequence of the sunk cost fallacy obviously is that we make bad decisions. We hold on to things that are hopeless. We hold on to projects that have no hope of ever being successful way longer than it would be worthwhile. And we keep investing money, time and effort into lost causes. This, of course, doesn't only occur on the small but also on the large scale. One example that is mentioned very often is the development of the Concorde, the supersonic passenger airplane that was developed by the British and French governments and big companies, and it was a great big project. However, it quickly turned out that the costs were increasing, that the costs would end up being a multitude of what was originally calculated, and it quickly turned out that the plane, once it was actually employed, actually used, would not create enough profits to cover the costs of development, so this project would never be profitable. However, the participants, the two governments, they stick to the project all the way to the end, and it never turned out to be profitable. And for this reason, the sunk cost fallacy is also sometimes referred to as Concorde effect or Concorde fallacy. I personally don't think this is the best example, because in that situation political considerations probably played a major role. So maybe it's difficult to say if the sunk cost fallacy really was the biggest driver of this story here, but as I said, it's frequently mentioned. Why do we fall for the sunk cost fallacy? Why do we make this mistake? Why is it so hard for us to ignore sunk costs? There are some other biases and fallacies that are related and that might shed some light on this. First of all, a very important mechanism here is loss aversion. This is a very important element of the prospect theory by Kahneman and Tversky. We discussed this in the book review of Thinking Fast and Slow. And loss aversion means that we take losses more seriously than gains. If I lose $100, bucks is whatever currency you have. If I lose $100, the negative feelings associated with the loss are bigger, greater than the positive feelings associated with the gain of $100. So losing the same amount is more severe than gaining the same amount. So we take losses pretty seriously. And therefore, it is, of course, difficult for us to realize a loss and to cut our losses. For example, to give up a hopeless project, because the moment I say, okay, we abort this project, all the investment and costs so far are lost. It kind of becomes official. And if I just let this hopeless project continue, well, everybody probably knows it's hopeless, but it's kind of not yet official. So this is a difficult step for us to make. And another aspect of prospect theory is also relevant here. We overestimate 100% certainty. This is called the certainty bias. So, let's recall the example of the Dull movie. I'm sitting in the cinema, I have the choice of staying through the second half or leaving and going home. Now, if I leave and go home, the time and money I have spent are lost with 100% certainty. Now, if I stay, there is a very tiny chance that the movie will turn out great in the second half and I will end up really getting some value for my money and time that I've invested for my sunk costs. Now, it's really a tiny chance, but we tend to overestimate this tiny chance, so we might stick to a hopeless project, clinging to this tiny chance because we overestimate it. There is another bias that is very similar to the sunk cost fallacy, and that one is called commitment bias or escalation of commitment. It is so similar actually that often they are not distinguished explicitly. For example, Wikipedia doesn't differentiate between sunk cost fallacy and escalation of commitment, and also Rolf Dobelli, who collects biases and fallacies in some books of his. We will have a book review of those soon. He also doesn't differentiate between sunk cost fallacy and escalation of commitment, but they are in fact slightly different. Sunk cost fallacy, as we already discussed, means that we take sunk costs into consideration when we make decisions, even though we should not. Escalation of commitment means that we stick to decisions we made in the past, and that we try hard not to make any changes, not to change our mind, that we try to be consistent, that we stick to what we decided before, even if it is no longer the best option. So, for example, if I am in a leadership position in a company and I started a project, and 2 years later this project is still running, but it has become clear in the meantime that it is a hopeless project, that will never be profitable, that it's just a waste of resources, and that should be stopped immediately, it's difficult for me to admit my mistake and to say, no, I was all for this project in the past, but now I abort it because the situation has changed. This is difficult for us to do. So this is, as you notice, quite similar to the sunk cost fallacy, but it is actually a bit different. And there are other errors, other biases and fallacies that probably are relevant here. For example, we tend to prefer the status quo over changes, or we tend to believe that damage that is caused by our inactivity is less problematic than damage that is caused by our actions. And we will probably encounter more fallacies and biases that play a role here as we continue to explore the topic. So one important question remains, obviously: how can we avoid the sunk cost fallacy? As usual, knowing about the fallacy, knowing how it works, doesn't prevent us from making the mistake. If we know about the sunk cost fallacy, we will still consider sunk costs in our decisions, unless we consciously make an effort not to do so, unless we consciously recognize what are sunk costs when we make a decision and consciously ignore them. Now, this sounds somewhat simple, but it is actually difficult, because we have to carefully distinguish between sunk costs and, for example, upcoming costs. Let's say I dislike my current profession and I'd rather do something different. But I say, oh, I spent all those years of my life on my education. I can just switch professions now. Now, this would obviously be a case of the sunk cost fallacy. However, it is certainly important to consider that if I switch to a different profession, I will need some qualification for my new profession, so I will need to spend time and effort and money and undergo training to acquire this qualification. And those are costs that are upcoming and that I need to take into account. I need to ask myself, am I willing to make this investment? Is moving to a different profession important enough for me to invest all this time and money and effort? Or let's say I am unhappy at my current job, but I say, oh, I moved to this place here just for this job, so I invested heavily into this job, I can't just stop now. This obviously would be the sunk cost fallacy again. However, let's say I am now at this place, town, whatever, and in this place, my current employer is the only bigger company, and to find another job, I would certainly have to move to a different place, different town, different city. Then this upcoming move would obviously be upcoming costs that I need to take into consideration. Is finding another job important enough for me to move to a different city? So we have to carefully distinguish. I would also advise to try to consider in advance when we are about to make investments of money, time, or whatever, to really ask ourselves, I am now about to sink money or time or whatever into this, and I will not get it back if things turn out badly, if things don't work out as I hope. And am I willing to risk this? Am I nonetheless willing to make this investment? I think it is also a good idea here to consider our own personality, to ask ourselves, am I a person who tends to hold on to lost causes for too long? Am I someone who fails to leave the sinking ship in time? Or am I someone who tends to give up too quickly? Someone who has problems sticking to something to the end, to see anything through? Now, if I am someone who is likely to stick to lost causes, the sunk cost fallacy is obviously something that is a very important issue for me because it is likely to occur very often. However, if I am someone who has problems seeing anything through anyway, the sunk cost fallacy will not be a major consideration. Finally, I think the idea that change is possible, that we are not bound by our past decisions and our past investments, that this is quite a nice and positive and reassuring idea. I'm thinking, for example, about young people who have to decide, who have to choose a career path, a future profession, a line of education. Now, I think for them it's good to know that even if their decision later turns out to be wrong, not to be what they actually want, they still have the option of choosing a different path later, and they are not bound to their decision for life. By the way, now that you've already sunk the time into watching this video, you might as well also click the like button. I would also be quite happy if you subscribe to the channel. We will see each other again next week when we discuss Occam's razor. This will be quite interesting as well. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.